The train slowly pulled into the station, its wheels screeching against the tracks, kicking up clouds of dust that swirled in the summer heat. It was as if the land itself wasn't in any hurry. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the quiet town. At the station, there wasn't much movement, just a handful of people gathered, waiting in silence. Some were there out of habit, others out of curiosity, but all of them shared one thing in common. Nothing ever came through this town without a warning. There are always letters first, then people. But today, there were no letters, no word, no warning. Only the train and the woman who stepped off it. Annie descended carefully from the train, her hand gripping the railing like it was the only thing holding her steady. She wasn't used to the wood under her hands, to the feeling of uncertainty in the air. Her movements were slow, calculated, as though her body remembered the discomfort of being watched, of being judged before even speaking. She wasn't tall, but her posture made her seem smaller, wrapped up in the layers of her old, worn dress. The fabric clung tightly to her waist and hips, as though it wasn't meant to fit her at all, like the fabric itself was ashamed of the task it was given. Her boots, though polished, were worn at the heels, and her hat, too small for her head, looked like it had belonged to someone she had once loved, but someone who no longer loved her back. She looked around, but the town felt too big, too foreign, like it wasn't hers to claim. She wasn't sure where to go, so she walked to a nearby bench and sat, setting her bag carefully beside her. It was a canvas bag, its bottom scuffed with wear, tied tightly with frayed rope as if to hold everything in place. Though Annie wasn't sure what exactly she was holding together. She sat quietly, her face turned slightly down, the heat already starting to gather under her arms, her mind racing. She wasn't expecting to be here. Not like this. The town was small, but the weight of the stairs felt heavy, especially when you were unannounced, unwanted. She had barely settled when the soft thud of small footsteps caught her attention. A little girl, no older than 7, appeared in front of her. She had big brown eyes that stared up at Annie with a kind of quiet confidence. Annie looked at her, unsure whether to smile or speak. But before she could say a word, the girl's voice, soft and sure, broke the silence. "You need a home, and I need a mama to care for my newborn sister." Annie froze, caught off guard by the boldness of the request. The child's words hung in the air, ringing in Annie's ears. The little girl didn't look worried, just hopeful, as though she had been waiting for this moment, as if she had known all along that Annie would be the one to answer. But Annie didn't know how to answer. How could she? She wasn't a mother. She wasn't even sure who she was. She didn't know what to say to this girl who, without knowing her story, had placed this heavy request on her shoulders. Before Annie could respond, a man's voice broke in, steady and sure. He was tall, his features weathered by time and hardship, with hands that looked both rough and gentle at the same time. He had a calm, commanding presence. His eyes scanned Annie first, then the little girl. "You're both coming with me," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality. Annie looked up, startled. The man stood a few feet away, his posture relaxed but firm, as though he had already made his decision and nothing could change it. He wasn't a stranger to making decisions like this, and something about the way he spoke told Annie that it wasn't a request, it was a statement. The little girl, without missing a beat, smiled and took Annie's hand, leading her toward the man. Without a second thought, the man turned and began walking toward the wagon parked nearby. Annie, still in shock, followed. There was a strange comfort in his certainty, something steady in the way he moved, but also a deep sense of mystery. Why was he doing this? Why had he stepped in? She wasn't sure, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that she didn't have anywhere else to go. The train had already left, and so had her options. As they walked together, the townsfolk, who had been watching silently from the sidelines, began to murmur. Whispers filled the air, their words sharp but muted by the heat. "Who's she?" one woman asked under her breath. "No one sent for her," another replied, her voice laced with judgment. Annie tried to ignore them, but she could feel their eyes on her, burning into her skin as she climbed into the wagon. The little girl, now sitting between them, leaned against Annie's side, her small body pressing close, as if claiming her new place in the world. The man turned to her then, his face serious but not unkind. "Name's Clayton," he said simply, as if offering the information for no other reason than to fill the silence. "Annie," she replied, her voice quieter than she intended, almost as if testing it out. Clayton gave a small nod as the wagon began to move. The town, once bustling with gossip, was now behind them, and the road ahead seemed uncertain, like a winding path she couldn't see all the way through. But as the dust swirled behind them, carried by the wheels of the wagon, Annie couldn't help but wonder if this strange, sudden moment was the beginning of something new or just another chapter in a long list of mistakes she had made. And yet, as they drove further into the distance, Annie realized something. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel entirely alone. The little girl beside her, the man in the front, and the soft creak of the wagon wheels beneath them made her wonder if this moment, for better or worse, was a kind of beginning. But as the sun dipped lower, the shadows growing longer, Annie knew she'd have to wait and see. Wait to find out if this strange new family was really hers, or if it would slip away as quietly as the train had come. The wagon rumbled down the dirt road, the sound of its wooden wheels creaking as it bounced over rocks and uneven ground. Clayton drove with steady hands, his gaze focused on the path ahead. Annie sat beside him. The little girl, Emily, nestled between them, her tiny hand clutching Annie's arm as if she had already claimed a place in this new world. The warm evening sun cast long shadows across the land, turning the earth beneath them into shades of golden brown. Annie didn't say much as the wagon moved forward, but the silence was heavy, as if each of them was waiting for something to break it. Some sign, some word that would make this strange situation feel less surreal. Annie had barely spoken since the train station. The decision to follow Clayton had been impulsive, almost instinctual. But now, as they passed the town that had just watched them leave, doubts began to creep into her mind. Was she making a mistake? Was this truly the right choice? She glanced over at Clayton, but his expression was unreadable. His hands, calloused from years of work, gripped the reins without any sign of strain. His jaw was set, his lips tight, as though he carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, though he hadn't said much about himself. Clayton was a man of few words, but what struck Annie was the certainty in his actions. He didn't need to explain why he was taking them in. He simply did. It was that quiet authority that made her feel both at ease and on edge at the same time. Emily, on the other hand, seemed unbothered by the long ride. Her small body leaned against Annie's side as she watched the landscape blur by. Annie noticed how trusting Emily was, how she seemed to take for granted that this new situation was just another part of life, like it was all normal. Annie envied that sense of security. She wished she could feel the same way, but her past weighed too heavily on her heart, reminding her that nothing in her life had ever come easily. "How far is it?" Annie asked quietly, her voice breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "Not far now," Clayton replied, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice that didn't need to be raised to command attention. "We'll be there soon." Annie nodded, but didn't ask any more questions. She was learning that Clayton wasn't the type of man to offer much more than what was necessary. He wasn't going to pour out his life story to her, and in a way, that was a relief. She didn't know if she was ready for anyone to ask about her past. Not here, not now. The road began to wind, leading them further away from the town and deeper into the open landscape. The trees began to thin out, replaced by tall grass and fields that stretched endlessly in every direction. The silence between them seemed less oppressive now. Maybe it was the peaceful rhythm of the wagon ride, Or maybe it was just the familiarity of the land. But Annie began to relax just a little. She hadn't realized how much she had been holding her breath since stepping off that train. Emily suddenly shifted, sitting up straighter, her eyes wide with excitement. "Look, a house!" she exclaimed, pointing ahead. Annie followed her gaze and saw it. A small, white house tucked between the hills, barely visible but standing proud against the vast expanse of land. It was simple, not much more than a box of wood with a roof and a chimney, but to Annie, it felt like something out of a dream. There was something about the way the house sat against the horizon that made it feel like a place of possibility, like it was meant for something or someone, like it was waiting for them. Clayton slowed the wagon as they neared the house. Annie could see that it wasn't much, but there was a sturdiness to it, a quiet strength that felt inviting rather than imposing. It didn't have the polished charm of a big city home, but there was something comforting about it. It felt like home. As they pulled up to the house, Clayton stopped the wagon and helped Annie down, his hand steady as he reached out to her. Emily hopped off the wagon by herself, already running toward the porch, eager to get inside. Annie noticed the newborn, swaddled tightly in a blanket, resting in a small basket that Clayton carefully lifted from the wagon. The baby, whom Emily called Lily, stirred slightly but remained asleep, her tiny face peaceful. Annie felt a wave of nervous energy rush over her. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but standing in front of the house, she realized that she wasn't just walking into a building. She was walking into a new life, one that was completely unknown to her. She hesitated for a moment, looking around at the land that stretched out in every direction. The house, the land, even the air felt different here. Cleaner, somehow less crowded by the noise and expectations of the world. Clayton must have sensed her uncertainty. He stepped up beside her, his expression unchanged. "It's not much," he said, almost as if apologizing, but there was a quiet pride in his voice. "But it's yours if you want it. Lily needs someone to look after her, and Emily's already decided you're the one." Annie nodded, not sure what else to say. She wanted to tell him that she wasn't sure if she deserved a place here, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she simply followed him inside, her eyes lingering on the tiny bundle in the basket. The house was simple, but it felt warm and lived in. The floors creaked underfoot, the scent of wood and earth mixing with the faint smell of something cooking in the kitchen. There was a small wood stove in the corner, a single chair at the table, and a book resting upside down beside a teacup. It was like the house had been waiting for something to fill it, for someone to make it feel like home. Emily was already inside, her small hands running over the old furniture with curiosity. She seemed at ease here, as if she had always belonged. Annie, on the other hand, felt like a visitor in someone else's life, unsure of how to act or where to place herself. She lingered in the doorway for a moment, taking it all in, watching as Clayton set Lily's basket gently on the table. Clayton turned to her, as if reading her mind. "This is where you'll sleep," he said, nodding toward the small room off to the side. "It's not fancy, but it's yours. Lily's cradle is in there, too. She'll need you close." Annie nodded, feeling a mixture of relief and apprehension. She wasn't sure what she had expected, but it wasn't this simple, humble welcome. She had spent so long feeling like she didn't belong anywhere, and now, in this quiet house, she was starting to wonder if this might be the place where she could find a little peace. As the day faded into evening and the sun sank lower behind the hills, Annie sat in the small room, trying to adjust to the silence around her. She checked on Lily, who slept soundly in her cradle, her tiny chest rising and falling. The only sound was the distant hum of insects and the soft creak of the house settling into the night. It was peaceful, but in a way that made her feel like she had no excuses left. She was here now, and there was no running away from the decision she had made. And so, as the night stretched on, Annie lay in the bed, staring at the ceiling, wondering what the next day would bring. Would this be the place she could finally call home? Or would she always feel like an outsider, just passing through? But for now, all she could do was wait and see. The morning light crept through the small window, casting a warm glow across the room. Annie woke to the quiet hum of the world outside, the sounds of the wind, the rustling of trees, and the distant call of birds. She hadn't realized how much she missed the silence, the absence of the constant noise and judgment that had followed her for years. Here, in this small house, the silence felt comforting, almost like a promise that things could be different. As she sat up, she noticed that the room was simple but clean. There was a bed with plain sheets, a small wooden dresser, and a thin rug on the floor. The walls were bare, save for a couple of nails where pictures could hang if someone decided to add them. It wasn't much, but it was enough. For the first time in a long while, Annie felt like she could breathe, truly breathe, without the weight of her past hanging over her. She glanced over at the doorway, where the shawl that Clayton's late wife had worn still hung, gently swaying in the morning breeze. She hadn't yet touched it, not because she didn't want to, but because she wasn't sure if it was hers to touch. It was a symbol of a life that didn't belong to her, a reminder of what Clayton had lost. But it also served as a reminder of what she was trying to build, something that could be hers. But for now, she chose to leave it hanging there, out of respect for the life that had once filled this space. Annie stood up and made her way to the kitchen, drawn by the smell of fresh coffee and something warm cooking. As she stepped into the room, she saw Clayton already at the stove, his back turned to her as he stirred something in a skillet. He didn't look up at her as she entered, but there was something in the air, an unspoken familiarity, a quiet acknowledgement that they were beginning to share something together. Lily's cradle was nearby, and Annie peeked in to see the baby still sleeping, her tiny fists curled tightly. "Good morning," Clayton said, his voice low but steady. "Morning," Annie replied softly, still feeling the weight of the awkwardness that came with being in someone else's home, living someone else's life. She took a seat at the small table, watching as he worked. He didn't offer her much in terms of conversation, but that was fine with Annie. Words hadn't ever come easy to her, especially since she left her past behind. But the silence between them was different now. It wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was shared, as if they were both quietly coming to terms with their new reality. "Coffee's on the table," Clayton said, gesturing with his chin. He poured himself a cup and took a sip, then handed the pot to her. Annie hesitated for a moment before accepting it. The warm liquid felt like a small comfort, a piece of normalcy she hadn't realized she'd been missing. "Thanks," she said as she poured herself a cup. They ate breakfast in silence. Eggs, bacon, and a loaf of homemade bread that smelled as good as it tasted. The food was simple, but Annie hadn't had a meal like this in a long time. She ate quietly, not wanting to disturb the fragile peace that had settled between them. Clayton, for his part, didn't seem to mind the quiet. He worked without speaking, and in some strange way, it felt like both of them were waiting for something to happen, something to change. After breakfast, Annie checked on Lily, gently adjusting her blanket to keep her warm. The baby stirred slightly, letting out a soft whimper, and Annie instinctively rocked the cradle, her movements hesitant but tender. Emily bounded into the kitchen, her energy filling the room. "Annie, can I help with Lily today?" she asked, her voice bright with excitement. "Sure, Emily," Annie said, smiling softly. "You can help me feed her later." Emily grinned, already chattering about how she wanted to be a big sister who took care of everything. Annie felt a warmth in her chest at the girl's enthusiasm, a sense that she was starting to belong here. She wasn't just a stranger anymore. She was someone Emily trusted, someone Lily needed. As the day went on, Annie took on the task of caring for both girls. She fed Lily with a bottle of milk Clayton had prepared, her hands steady but cautious as she held the tiny infant. She wasn't sure she was doing it right, but the way Lily latched onto the bottle and quieted down gave her a small sense of accomplishment. Emily stayed close, watching with wide eyes, and calling Annie Mama for the first time. The word caught Annie off guard, her heart skipping a beat, but she didn't correct the girl. It felt strange, but it also felt right. Later that afternoon, Emily came running inside, her bare feet slapping against the wooden floor. "Mama, look what I found," she exclaimed, holding up a small bundle of wildflowers. The little girl's face was beaming, her joy infectious. She handed the flowers to Annie with a proud smile. "They're for you, Mama," Emily said, her voice full of pride. Annie smiled softly, taking the flowers and holding them in her hands. It was such a small thing, but the gesture meant more than words could say. It felt like Emily was starting to see her as more than just a caretaker. She was seeing her as a mother. "Thank you, Emily," Annie said, her voice filled with gratitude. "They're beautiful." Emily beamed, happy that her simple gift had made Annie smile. She ran back outside, disappearing into the yard where she was probably already busy with some new adventure. Annie stood there for a moment, the flowers in her hands, and took a deep breath. She could feel the weight of her past still hanging over her. But in that moment, surrounded by the quiet warmth of the house and the sound of Emily's laughter outside, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this could be enough. Clayton returned later that evening, his boots heavy with dust from the day's work. As he stepped into the house, he caught sight of Annie holding the flowers, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth. "Papa," Emily called out, running to him and wrapping her arms around his legs. Clayton ruffled her hair, his expression softening in a way Annie hadn't seen before. He didn't say anything about Emily's use of "Papa," but the small nod he gave Annie was all the approval she needed. It was like he really saw her for the first time, not just the woman who had arrived with a troubled past, but the woman who was starting to make a place for herself in this house, in their family. And as the evening wore on, with the scent of dinner filling the house, Annie realized something. She was beginning to belong, not just to Clayton, but to Emily, to Lily, to the life they were building together. It wasn't perfect, and it certainly wasn't easy, but it was real. And that was more than she had ever hoped for. The night ended with a quiet meal. The four of them, Annie, Clayton, Emily, and Lily, sitting together at the table. It was simple, but it felt like a family. A family that Annie never thought she'd have, but one she was starting to see could be hers. The days passed in a quiet rhythm, but Annie's focus remained on Emily and Lily. She spent her mornings tending to the girls, feeding Lily with care and playing with Emily, who now called her Mama without hesitation. The word still felt foreign to Annie, but each time Emily said it, it sank deeper into her heart, anchoring her to this new life. She bathed Lily, changed her swaddles, and sang softly to her when she fussed, her voice unsteady at first but growing more confident with time. Emily followed her everywhere, eager to help, her small hands clumsy but earnest as she folded blankets or held Lily's bottle. Despite the peace of the ranch, there was a tension that hung in the air, an unspoken unease that Annie couldn't shake. The town, every time she passed through its narrow streets, she could feel the eyes of the townsfolk on her. It wasn't subtle. Whispers followed her, the way they stared, the way they talked behind her back. It didn't matter that Clayton had brought her here, that he had taken responsibility for her and the girls. In their eyes, Annie was an outsider, a stranger who had no right to be here. No matter how much she cared for Emily and Lily, no matter how much she tried to blend in, she couldn't escape the feeling that she would never be accepted. That feeling came to a head one afternoon when Annie and Clayton went into town to pick up supplies, Emily holding Annie's hand and Lily cradled in her arms. The wagon ride was uneventful, the road stretching out before them as they approached the bustling little town center. Clayton's stoic presence next to her was the only thing that kept her from feeling completely exposed. He hadn't spoken much on the way there, and she didn't mind. His silence, like always, wasn't uncomfortable. It was just who he was. But Annie couldn't ignore the rising tension in her chest as the wagon rolled into the heart of the town. As soon as they arrived, the whispers began. It was as if the entire town held its breath when they saw them pull up. Women stopped talking mid-sentence, their eyes darting toward Annie, then away, as if afraid they might be caught looking. Men leaned against buildings, pretending to mind their own business, but their gazes were sharp, appraising. Annie could almost feel the judgment pressed down on her like a weight, even as Emily clung to her, calling her mama in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. They made their way through the town square, Annie's eyes glued to the ground, trying to ignore the looks. Clayton, however, walked with purpose, his gait steady and confident, carrying Lily's basket with care. There was something about his presence that demanded attention, respect, even if it wasn't always given willingly. As they passed a group of women near the general store, one of them snickered loudly, just enough for Annie to hear. "Can you believe it? Clayton Turner, with a woman like that? And those girls calling her mama already." Annie's stomach turned, and she quickly looked away, trying to push the words out of her mind. But they stuck with her, gnawing at her insides. She wasn't just some stranger anymore. She was a widow's replacement, a mother to two girls who needed her. The town didn't know her, but they were already casting their judgment on her, and it stung. Clayton must have noticed her discomfort. As they passed the store, he reached out and gently placed his hand on her arm. It wasn't an overt gesture, but it was enough. His touch was firm, reassuring, as though to say, "Don't worry about them." He didn't need to say the words aloud. Annie could feel the weight of his reassurance in that simple touch. But as they reached the post office, things took a more pointed turn. The sheriff, a tall man with a face that had seen too many hard years, stepped forward, tipping his hat in Clayton's direction. He looked at Annie with a slight frown, then at Emily and Lily, as though he had questions he was too polite to ask. "Clayton," the sheriff said, his voice low, barely audible over the bustle of the street. "You know this lady?" Clayton stopped, his hand still on Annie's arm, Lily's basket steady in his other hand. He didn't flinch at the sheriff's question, didn't pause for a moment to consider. His answer was simple and clear. "I do now." The sheriff raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Annie could feel the tension rising around them, the townsfolk waiting for the sheriff's next words. Emily squeezed Annie's hand, whispering, "Mama, is everything okay?" Annie nodded, forcing a small smile to reassure her. But before they could move on, the sheriff called out one last time, louder than before. "You taking her and those girls out to the ranch? They're calling you Papa now, too, I hear." Clayton's reply was firm, unyielding. "Yep, they're my family." Annie could feel her face flush with heat, though she tried her best to keep her composure. She could hear the whispers, the sharpness of the town's judgment in the air around her, but Clayton didn't seem to notice. He didn't flinch. He didn't look at the townsfolk. He didn't look at her, either, but she could feel the quiet power in his presence. He wasn't asking for their approval. He was simply claiming what was his. And Annie, Emily, and Lily were part of that. As the sheriff stepped back, Clayton turned to Annie, his gaze steady but filled with something more, protectiveness. He didn't say much, but his words were clear. Let them talk. Annie didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to this kind of protection, and it made her uneasy. She had never been given the benefit of the doubt, never been defended without question. It was foreign, and it left her feeling vulnerable. But in that vulnerability, she also felt something else, something she hadn't felt in a long time: acceptance. They finished their errands quickly, though Annie couldn't shake the feeling that the town was watching them, judging them, as they walked through the general store. It was clear that things wouldn't be easy for her here. There would be no escaping the whispers, no hiding from the judgments of the people who saw her as nothing more than a stranger. But Clayton's quiet defense, his steadfast determination to stand by her side, gave her something she hadn't had in a long time: hope. It was the first real gesture of solidarity she had felt since arriving in town, and it planted a seed of belonging in her heart. Emily's small hand in hers and Lily's soft breaths in the basket reminded her why she was here. Not just for herself, but for the girls who needed her. As they left the store and walked back to the wagon, Annie looked at Clayton. This time, she didn't look away. She held his gaze for a moment, a flicker of understanding passing between them. She still didn't fully trust this new life, didn't know if she truly belonged here. But for the first time, it didn't seem like an impossible dream. It felt real. And for the first time since she stepped off that train, Annie began to believe that maybe, just maybe, this could be home. As they drove back to the ranch, the quiet hum of the wagon's wheels underfoot seemed to carry them farther from the town and its judgments. They were headed towards something better, towards something worth fighting for. And though Annie couldn't quite name it yet, she could feel that change was coming, and it started with her accepting that she was finally part of something. The following days at the ranch fell into a rhythm that, despite its simplicity, brought a sense of stability Annie had longed for. Her focus was almost entirely on Emily and Lily. Mornings began early with the soft chirp of birds outside the window, and Annie's first task was always to check on Lily, feeding her with a bottle, changing her swaddles, and rocking her gently when she fussed. Emily was her constant shadow, eager to help with her little sister, her small hands carefully holding the bottle or folding tiny blankets. "Mama, can I sing to Lily?" she'd ask, and Annie would nod, her heart swelling as Emily's soft voice filled the room with a lullaby. The chores were constant but manageable. Feeding the animals, sweeping the floors, and baking bread, which Clayton seemed to appreciate in his quiet way. Emily, full of life, would run in and out of the house, her laughter ringing through the air, often calling Annie Mama, as naturally as if she'd always done it. Lily, too, seemed to sense Annie's presence, her tiny eyes following her as she moved about the room. Annie wasn't sure if she was doing everything right, but the girl's trust in her gave her a purpose she hadn't felt before. It was during one of these quiet evenings, over a simple meal they shared as a family in the cozy kitchen, that Clayton broke the silence in a way that made Annie's heart skip a beat. The table was set with care, with enough food to fill their bellies, but nothing more. Annie had grown accustomed to the comfort of it all, the steady rhythm of meals, the soft glow of the lamp at night, and the quiet companionship she shared with Clayton, Emily, and Lily. "Annie," Clayton said, his voice steady but not without a certain weight. He set down his fork, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked at her directly. "I've been thinking about this for a while, and I reckon it's time we had a proper conversation." Annie stopped mid-bite, her fork hovering in the air. She hadn't expected the conversation to go this way. She placed her fork down, carefully, trying to read his face. Clayton's gaze was serious, but there was something softer in his eyes, something that made her heart flutter with uncertainty. Emily looked up from her plate, curious, while Lily slept peacefully in her cradle nearby. "What's on your mind?" Annie asked, though she had a sinking feeling she already knew the direction this conversation was heading. Clayton took a breath, his eyes scanning her face for a moment as if searching for something. Then he spoke, his words clear and deliberate. "You've been here for a while now, Annie, and I've seen how you are with Emily and Lily. You stepped into their lives like they were your own, caring for them, loving them. You've taken care of things I can't, and I'm not asking you to stay out of necessity. I want you here with me, with the girls, as a family." Annie's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected the conversation to take this turn. It wasn't about survival or duty anymore. It was about something deeper. But before she could respond, Clayton added, "I'm asking you to stay here, not just as the woman who's helping out, but as my wife. I need you, Annie. I reckon I've needed you for longer than I knew. Emily calls you Mama, and I want to be Papa to both of them, with you by my side." Annie's heart raced as she processed his words. The weight of them was heavy, and for a moment, she wasn't sure how to respond. A wife? It felt too foreign, too out of reach. She had never been the type of woman who thought about marriage, at least not in the way Clayton was offering. Her past had been marked by loneliness and rejection, and yet, in Clayton's eyes, she felt something different. She felt like she was needed, not just for the girls, but for him. Clayton watched her carefully, waiting for a response. His calm demeanor remained, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his gaze, something that softened his rugged exterior. He wasn't pushing her, but he was making it clear that this was what he wanted. "I'm not asking for a grand ceremony or anything like that," he continued. "But I need you to know that if you're willing to stay, you won't just be here to keep house. You'll be mine, as much as I am yours, and we'll be a family for Emily and Lily." Annie's mind raced. Her past echoed in the silence between them, reminding her of the hurt she had left behind. She hadn't been able to hold on to anything before. Not a home, not a family, not even her own dignity. But here, with Clayton, Emily, and Lily, it felt different. She wasn't just a replacement for someone lost. She was a person, a woman who had something to offer, something of her own. The way Emily called her Mama, and the way Lily calmed in her arms made her believe she could be more than her past. But even as these thoughts swirled in her mind, Annie couldn't ignore the fear that had settled deep in her chest. She had lived most of her life without love, had existed on the fringes, never quite finding her place. The idea of being wanted, of being claimed in such a profound way, was terrifying. What if she couldn't live up to what Clayton needed? What if, in trying to build something new, she destroyed it instead? Clayton's steady presence didn't help calm her nerves. His quiet confidence only made her feel more unsure. But there was also something in his voice, in the way he looked at her, trust, perhaps, or maybe something more. He didn't just see her as a means to an end. He saw her as part of something bigger, a piece of his life that had been missing for far too long. Annie took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing thoughts. She looked down at her hands, still trembling slightly, and then back up at Clayton. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she said quietly. "I've never been the kind of woman who can just step into a life like this. I'm not sure I can be the wife you're asking for, or the mother Emily and Lily deserve." Clayton's expression softened, and he reached across the table, placing his hand gently over hers. "I'm not asking for a perfect wife or a perfect mother, Annie. I'm asking for you, and I reckon that's enough. It's more than enough. The girls already love you, and—" He paused, his voice catching for a moment. "I see you with them, and I know you what they need. What we all need." The sincerity in his voice made her chest tighten. It was like he was offering her something she hadn't known she needed, something she hadn't realized was missing in her life. He wasn't asking for perfection, just for her presence. And for the first time in years, Annie wondered if she might be worthy of it. "I don't know what this is," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I know that. I don't want to leave. I don't want to be alone again. I want to be here for Emily and Lily." Clayton nodded, his eyes soft but filled with an unspoken promise. "You don't have to be alone. Not anymore. You're part of this family now, Annie. And I'm asking you to stay." Annie felt a lump rise in her throat, and for the first time since she stepped off a train, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Maybe this was what she had been searching for all along. Maybe in Clayton, Emily, and Lily, she had found the family she never thought she would have. "I'll stay," she whispered, her voice breaking the silence between them. "I'll stay." Clayton smiled, and in that smile, Annie saw something she hadn't seen in a long time, a future. One that wasn't perfect, but one that was real. And for the first time in her life, she was ready to take that step. The proposal wasn't grand, but in that moment, it felt like the beginning of everything Annie had been running toward. It wasn't just about finding a place to belong. It was about finding a place to stay, a place where she could be a mother to Emily and Lily, a wife to Clayton, and finally herself. As the night stretched on and the house settled into a comfortable silence, Annie checked on Lily one last time, tucking her blanket around her tiny form. Emily was already asleep, her small body curled up in her bed. a smile lingering on her face. Annie knew that this was just the beginning. There was a long road ahead, filled with uncertainties, but for the first time, she wasn't walking alone. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough to carry her forward. The following week passed quietly on the ranch, the steady rhythm of daily chores creating a sense of normalcy that Annie had begun to crave. Her days revolved around Emily and Lily, feeding, bathing, and soothing the baby, while teaching Emily small tasks like folding clothes or fetching water. Emily's constant chatter and Lily's soft coos filled the house with life, and Annie found herself smiling more, her heart lighter with every mama that slipped from Emily's lips. Even Lily, too young to speak, seemed to recognize Annie, her tiny hands reaching out whenever Annie held her. But just when she thought things were calming down, the town reminded her of its presence. Word spread fast in small places, and soon enough, everyone knew about Clayton's new arrangement with Annie and the girls. The whispers returned, the pointed glances, and the quiet judgment that had always followed her. This time, however, the stakes felt higher. The town had its eyes on her more than ever before, questioning her place as Emily and Lily's mother, and the weight of their scrutiny was unbearable. Annie could feel it the moment they entered town. The wagon, as usual, creaked and bumped along the dirt road, but this time there was a different kind of tension in the air. Emily sat close to Annie, holding her hand, while Lily slept in her cradle in the wagon bed. The quiet murmur of the town square grew louder as they passed. She could feel the eyes on her, like 1,000 tiny needles pricking at her skin. The women in the general store whispered behind their hands, casting furtive glances her way. The children, who once would have run to greet Emily, now stared curiously, unsure whether to wave or hide behind their mothers. Clayton, as always, walked with purpose, his jaw set and his gaze ahead, carrying Lily's cradle with care. He was unfazed by the judgment that followed them. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back. Annie, however, was a different story. She felt exposed, like a painting on display, with the whole town waiting for her to crack under the pressure. Emily sensed her unease and whispered, "Mama, why are they looking at us like that?" Annie squeezed her hand, forcing a smile, but her heart was heavy. As they passed the post office, a familiar voice called out, and Annie's stomach dropped. The sheriff stepped forward, his tall frame blocking their path. His hat was tipped slightly, and he regarded Annie with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He'd been one of the few to acknowledge her presence when she first arrived in town, but today, there was something different in the way he looked at her. "Clayton," the sheriff said, his tone measured but pointed. "You're still holding strong to this, huh? Got yourself a whole family now, I hear. Those girls calling you Papa and her Mama." Clayton stopped, his gaze steady as he turned to face the sheriff, Lily's cradle secure in his hands. There was no hesitation in his movements, no sign of insecurity. "I am," Clayton replied simply. "What about it?" The sheriff studied him for a moment, then glanced at Annie, Emily, and Lily. The tension in the air thickened, and for a moment, Annie felt like she was suffocating under the weight of his gaze. She wanted to look away, to hide, but she forced herself to meet his eyes, clutching Emily's hand tighter. She wasn't sure if she was ready for this kind of confrontation, but she knew that she had to face it head on for the girls. "You know what they're saying," the sheriff continued, his eyes shifting between Clayton and Annie. "People don't like it, Clayton. They're wondering if you've gone and lost your mind. A man like you, taking in a woman with no name, no history, and now raising those girls like they're yours. It doesn't sit right with folks." Clayton's expression remained unchanged, his jaw tight but resolute. "I'm not here to please the town, Sheriff," he said, his voice low but firm. "I'm here to do what's right for me, for Annie, and for Emily and Lily. They're my family now, and that's all that matters." Annie felt a strange warmth spread through her chest at the way Clayton said it. Family. She wasn't just some stranger anymore. She wasn't just filling a role. She was someone to him, to Emily, to Lily. He was standing up for her, for them, and in that moment, something inside Annie clicked into place. She wasn't just an outsider. She was part of their family, a mother to the girls, and Clayton's partner. But the sheriff wasn't done yet. He stepped forward, his boots thudding on the dusty ground, and his gaze softened slightly. "I get it, Clayton. I really do. But you know how the town is. People will talk. They'll say things that could make life difficult for you, for all of you." Clayton stood his ground, his shoulders squared, his eyes never wavering from the sheriff's. "Let them talk. I'm not changing what I've decided. Annie's here to stay, and so are the girls. They call me Papa, and I'm proud to be that for them." The sheriff paused, looking at Annie once more, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if he were weighing her. After a long moment, he sighed, tipping his hat back. "All right, Clayton, if you say so, but you know I have to report it. People will be asking questions." "I'll deal with it," Clayton said, his voice hard but not unkind. "I don't need anyone's permission." The sheriff gave a nod and stepped back, tipping his hat to Annie this time. "I'll leave you to it then. Just remember, folks are watching." Annie's heart pounded in her chest as the sheriff walked away. She couldn't tell if it was fear or relief that filled her, but something was changing. Clayton's defense had been simple, but it had been enough. He hadn't asked for permission. He hadn't waited for anyone's approval. He had claimed his family, Annie, Emily, and Lily, and that was something Annie had never been given before. As they moved through the town, the silence between them felt different. Annie was no longer drowning in the whispers. She felt the strength of Clayton's words, the quiet confidence that had always been part of him. He wasn't going to let the town dictate what was right or wrong. And somehow, in that moment, Annie began to feel like she didn't have to apologize for her presence anymore. Emily's small hand in hers and Lily's soft weight in the cradle reminded her of her purpose. She was here for them, and they were her family. When they reached the wagon to head back to the ranch, Clayton glanced over at Annie. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. But there was something in his eyes, something that made Annie feel seen in a way she never had before. "Ready to head home, Mama?" he asked, his voice as steady as always, echoing the name Emily had given her. Annie nodded, the weight of the town's judgment still heavy, but not nearly as suffocating. "Yeah, Papa," she said, her voice steady for the first time in days, a small smile breaking through as Emily giggled at the word. "I'm ready." As they rode back to the ranch, Annie looked out over the landscape, the fields stretching out in every direction, Emily chattering beside her, and Lily sleeping soundly. The land was vast and open, and for the first time, she realized something. This was her life now, not the town's, not anyone else's. She wasn't going to be defined by the whispers or the looks. She wasn't going to hide anymore. She had a place here with Clayton, Emily, and Lily, and that was enough. When they reached the ranch, Clayton stopped the wagon, and they both got down, Emily skipping ahead and Annie carrying Lily's cradle. As they walked toward the house, Annie could feel the quiet strength of the place beneath her feet. Clayton had stood up for her, for their family, and she was beginning to understand that, with him, she didn't have to fight for a place anymore. She already had one. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the ranch, Annie realized that, for the first time, she wasn't an outsider. She was home, a mother to Emily and Lily, a partner to Clayton, and part of a family that called her Mama and him Papa.